The penthouse apartment sat on the 47th floor of Manhattan's most exclusive building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city that never sleeps. But for Richard Chen, those windows had become a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. He sat in his custom wheelchair, staring out at the glittering lights below, remembering a time when he used to run through those very streets, when he climbed mountains for fun. When his body obeyed every command his mind gave it. 2 years ago, Richard was unstoppable. At 52 years old, he had built a tech empire from nothing. He started coding in his parents' garage in Queens, and now his company was worth billions. He was the guy everyone wanted to meet, the name that made investors pull out their checkbooks without hesitation. Life was perfect, until that rainy Tuesday night in November. The accident happened so fast. One moment he was driving home from a board meeting, probably going a bit too fast because he was excited about a new product launch. The next moment, a truck ran a red light, the sound of metal crushing against metal, the feeling of his car flipping over. Then darkness. When he woke up 3 days later in the hospital, the doctors had that look on their faces, that careful, practiced expression that medical professionals use when they're about to destroy someone's world. "Mr. Chen, we did everything we could," the surgeon said, pulling up X-rays and scans that meant nothing to Richard at the time. "The damage to your spinal cord was severe. The vertebrae at L1 and L2 were completely shattered. We've stabilized you, but the paralysis below your waist appears to be permanent." Permanent. That word echoed in Richard's head for weeks. No more morning jogs. No more hiking trips. No more dancing at galas. No more taking the stairs 2 at a time when he was too impatient to wait for the elevator. His legs, once strong and reliable, now just dead weight attached to his body. The first few months were a blur of surgeries, physical therapy sessions that went nowhere, and an endless parade of specialists who all said the same thing in different ways. They used phrases like spinal cord injury is complex, and we don't fully understand neural regeneration, and you'll need to adjust to your new normal. Richard spent millions trying every treatment available. Experimental surgeries in Switzerland, stem cell therapy in South Korea, traditional medicine practitioners in China. Nothing worked. His legs remained stubbornly still. The worst part wasn't even the physical limitation. It was watching his empire crumble. His competitors smelled blood in the water. Board members who used to hang on his every word started having secret meetings. The company's stock dropped 23% in 6 months. Investors got nervous. His CFO began making decisions without consulting him. They didn't say it out loud, but Richard could read between the lines. A disabled CEO is bad for business. They wanted him out. His personal life fell apart too. His girlfriend of 3 years left him 4 months after the accident. She didn't even have the courage to say it was because of the wheelchair. She gave him some story about needing space to find herself and growing in different directions. But Richard knew the truth. She signed up for a billionaire who could sweep her off her feet, not one who couldn't even stand up. Friends stopped calling. At first, they visited the hospital with flowers and encouraging words. But as months turned into a year, then 2 years, the visits became rare. People got uncomfortable around disability. They didn't know what to say, how to act. It was easier for them to just fade away. Richard understood, but it still hurt. His days became depressingly routine. Wake up. Transfer to the wheelchair, shower with help from a nurse he barely knew, breakfast, stare at financial reports that showed his company slowly dying, lunch, more reports, dinner, sleep, repeat. The penthouse that once hosted legendary parties now felt like a prison with an expensive view. He went through a rotation of caregivers. Most were fine, professional, competent. They helped him with daily tasks, administered medications, made sure he didn't develop pressure sores or infections. But they were just doing a job. No one really saw him anymore. They saw a patient, a task list, a paycheck. That's why he barely noticed when Kenya Rodriguez joined his care team on a cold February evening. She was just another face, another person who would help him shower and transfer from bed to chair while being aggressively cheerful about it. Richard had learned to tune out the forced positivity. Kenya was 28 years old, originally from Brooklyn, with her grandmother's Jamaican accent still coloring some of her words. She wore her natural hair in neat braids and had the kind of warm smile that actually reached her eyes. Unlike the others, she didn't treat Richard like a fragile piece of china. She talked to him like a normal person, even called him out when he was being unnecessarily grumpy. "You know, the view from here is incredible," she said one evening while helping him prepare for bed. "When I was growing up, we could barely afford our rent. I used to dream about living somewhere with even one window that didn't face a brick wall." Richard grunted non-committally. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. Kenya didn't take the hint. "My abuela always said that blessings come in packages we don't recognize. Sometimes the thing we think is a curse is actually redirecting us towards something better." "That's easy to say when you can walk," Richard snapped. Kenya paused, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry. That was insensitive." Her genuine apology caught Richard off guard. Most caregivers just smiled nervously and changed the subject when he got sharp with them. What Richard didn't know was that Kenya was working 3 jobs. Caregiver during the evening, waitress on weekends, and spending every free moment in a cramped laboratory space she rented month to month in a questionable part of Queens. She was a biochemist, trained at Columbia University, with a mind that could have landed her a comfortable job at any pharmaceutical company. But Kenya had her own vision, her own research that everyone told her was impossible. She was developing something revolutionary, a compound that could potentially regenerate damaged neural pathways. It came from an unlikely source, a combination of rare plants her grandmother grew in Jamaica mixed with cutting-edge nanotechnology that Kenya had been perfecting for 5 years. She'd presented her research to 17 different pharmaceutical companies. All 17 rejected her. Too risky, they said. Not enough preliminary data. Too unconventional. Some didn't even bother reading past her credentials before dismissing her. So Kenya worked alone, funding everything herself, getting deeper into debt, surviving on coffee and determination. She knew she was onto something. The cellular tests showed promise. The animal trials, though limited by her budget, suggested it could work. But she needed human trials, and no ethics board would approve her research without millions in backing and years of additional testing. Kenya watched Richard carefully during her shifts. She noticed things the expensive specialists missed. The occasional muscle twitch in his left calf. The way his knee would sometimes respond to unexpected stimuli. Small signs that maybe, just maybe, his injury wasn't as permanent as everyone believed. His nervous system was damaged, yes, but perhaps not completely dead. 3 months into working for Richard, Kenya overheard a conversation that changed everything. She was in the next room organizing medical supplies when Richard's phone rang on speaker. It was his lead attorney with bad news. The board was moving to remove him as CEO. They'd found a legal loophole. The vote was scheduled for next month. After the call ended, Kenya heard something that broke her heart. Richard Chen, the brilliant billionaire who built an empire, was crying. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet, defeated tears of a man who had lost everything and saw no way forward. Kenya stood in the doorway, holding a bottle of medication, making a decision that could cost her everything. She was going to tell him about her research. She was going to offer him hope, even if that hope might be false. Because sometimes believing in the impossible is the only thing that keeps us alive. Kenya couldn't sleep that night. She kept hearing the sound of Richard's quiet tears, kept seeing the defeat in his eyes. She'd spent 5 years developing her compound, 5 years being told she was chasing fantasies, 5 years watching her bank account drain while everyone said her research would never work. But what was the point of all that work if she was too scared to actually use it when someone desperately needed it? The next evening, she arrived at Richard's penthouse with her heart pounding. She'd brought something with her, hidden in her bag. A small vial of iridescent liquid that shifted between blue and green depending on how the light hit it. This was it. The compound she'd spent every spare dollar and every sleepless night creating. Richard was in his usual spot by the window, staring at nothing. His face looked grayer than usual, and Kenya noticed he hadn't touched his dinner. The board meeting was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks until he lost the last piece of his identity. "Mr. Chen," Kenya started, then stopped. She'd practiced this conversation 100 times in her head, but now all her rehearsed words felt inadequate. "If you're going to give me another speech about staying positive, save it," Richard said without turning around. I'm really not in the mood tonight. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. Kenya pulled a chair over and sat down directly in his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. I overheard your phone call yesterday. I know about the board vote. Richard's jaw tightened. Great. So now my caregiver knows what a complete failure I've become. You're not a failure. You're injured. There's a difference. Kenya took a deep breath. Look, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen without interrupting, okay? Because what I'm about to say is going to sound absolutely insane. For the first time in days, Richard actually looked interested in something. I'm listening, Kenya explained everything. Her background in biochemistry, her grandmother's knowledge of traditional Caribbean medicine, the 5 years she'd spent developing a neural regeneration compound, the rejections from pharmaceutical companies, the promising results in cellular and animal testing. She pulled out her phone and showed him research data, videos of mice with spinal injuries regaining movement, cellular scans showing nerve regeneration. Richard listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Kenya finally stopped talking, he was quiet for a long moment. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. You're a trained biochemist working as a caregiver because you've been spending all your money on research that no legitimate institution will fund. And you think this mystery liquid you cooked up in a basement lab might cure paralysis? I know how it sounds, Kenya said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm not guaranteeing anything. The honest truth is, I don't know if it'll work on humans. I don't know if it'll work on you specifically. Your injury is complex, but I've seen enough promising results to believe there's a real chance. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Because you're giving up, Kenya said bluntly. And I get it. I really do. You've tried everything, spent millions, seen the best doctors in the world, and nothing changed. But this is different. This is something new. And yeah, maybe it won't work. Maybe I'm wrong about everything, but what if I'm not? What if there's even a 5% chance that you could walk again? Isn't that worth trying? Richard wheeled himself closer to her, studying her face. You could lose your license for this. If anyone found out you were experimenting on a patient without approval or oversight, I know. It could be dangerous. There could be side effects we don't know about. It could make things worse. I know that too. So why risk it? Kenya met his eyes directly. Because I became a scientist to help people, not to file paperwork and wait for permission from committees who are more interested in profits than patients. Because my grandmother always told me that knowledge without action is just noise. And because I think you deserve a chance to fight back. Richard was quiet for a long time, processing everything. His analytical mind, the same one that had built a business empire, started working through the angles. If we did this, and that's a massive if, what would it involve? Kenya pulled out a folder she'd prepared. The compound needs to be applied topically, directly to your spine twice a day. It works by using nanoparticles to penetrate the damaged tissue and stimulate dormant neural pathways. Think of it like jump-starting a car battery, but for your nerves. At the same time, you'd need intensive physical therapy. Your muscles have atrophied over 2 years. Even if the nerves regenerate, you'd need to rebuild strength. How long would it take to see results? If there are any results, that's the thing. I don't know. In mice, we saw changes within a few weeks. But human neural tissue is more complex. It could take months. It might not work at all. Kenya paused. I have to be completely honest with you, Mr. Chen. This is experimental in every sense of the word. I can't make you any promises. Richard looked at the vial Kenya had placed on the table. The liquid inside seemed to shimmer with possibility. Or maybe that was just desperate hope playing tricks on his eyes. He thought about the board meeting, about losing his company, about spending the rest of his life in this chair, watching the world move on without him. What do you need from me? He finally asked. Kenya felt a surge of adrenaline. Funding. Access to a private facility where we can work without interference. Your consent to be the first human trial subject. And honestly, your trust. My lawyers would have a field day with the liability issues. Then we get ironclad waivers drawn up. Make it clear that you're doing this of your own free will, fully understanding the risks. Richard laughed, a sound Kenya hadn't heard from him in the 3 months she'd been working for him. You know what the crazy part is? This is the most excited I've felt about anything in 2 years. even if it's probably going to fail spectacularly. Does that mean you're considering it? I'm considering it. Richard turned his chair to face the window again, but this time his posture was different. Less defeated, more alert. Give me 24 hours to think about it. And Kenya? Don't mention this to anyone else on the care team. Or anyone at all, of course. That night, Richard barely slept. He researched Kenya's educational background, verified her credentials from Columbia, even tracked down some of her published papers from her university days. The woman was brilliant, no question about that. But brilliant people could still be wrong. He called his personal physician at 2 in the morning. Doc, hypothetically speaking, if someone had developed an experimental topical treatment for spinal cord injuries, what would be the worst-case scenario if I tried it? His doctor sighed. Richard, please tell me you're not about to do something incredibly stupid. Just answer the question. Worst case? Infection, allergic reaction, further damage to the nervous system, organ failure if something toxic gets into your bloodstream. Best case? Nothing happens and you're out some money. The middle ground is where it gets complicated. You might see placebo effects, or minor improvements that don't mean anything long-term. Without proper trials and safety data, you're essentially playing Russian roulette with your health. What if I told you I'm already dying? Maybe not physically, but in every way that matters. The doctor was quiet. Then I'd say I understand, and I'd ask if there's anything I can do to help. Richard made his decision that night. He was going to do it, not because he was certain it would work, not even because he thought the odds were in his favor, but because doing nothing was its own kind of death, and he'd rather go down fighting than fade away in this chair. The next evening, when Kenya arrived for her shift, Richard was waiting for her with his legal team on video call. I'm in, he said simply. Let's make medical history. Or let's fail spectacularly trying. Either way, I'm done sitting around waiting to die. Kenya felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Okay, then. Let's get to work. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard's lawyers drew up documents so airtight that even the most aggressive prosecutor couldn't claim he'd been coerced. He liquidated some investments and set up a private medical facility in a building he owned in New Jersey. He hired a small team of physical therapists who signed strict non-disclosure agreements. He didn't tell his board, his family, or anyone who might try to stop him. Kenya moved into a guest room in the facility, essentially going into hiding from her other jobs. Richard paid off her debts and gave her unlimited funding for supplies. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to choose between buying groceries and buying lab equipment. On the first day of treatment, Kenya stood in the private medical room they'd set up, holding the vial of her compound. Her hands shook slightly. You nervous? Richard asked from the treatment table. Terrified, Kenya admitted. What if I'm wrong? What if this hurts you? Richard smiled. Then we'll deal with it. But Kenya, thank you for giving me something I haven't had in 2 years. Hope. Kenya applied the first dose of the shimmering liquid to Richard's spine. It absorbed into his skin almost immediately, leaving a faint tingling sensation. They both held their breath, waiting for something dramatic to happen. Nothing did. Well, Richard said after a moment. That was anticlimactic. Kenya laughed nervously. Yeah, told you this might take a while. What neither of them knew was that at a cellular level, deep in Richard's damaged spinal tissue, something was beginning to wake up. The first 6 weeks were brutal. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. Kenya applied the compound twice daily, every single day, massaging it into Richard's spine while he lay on the treatment table. The liquid absorbed into his skin, leaving that same faint tingling sensation, and then nothing. No movement, no feeling. No change whatsoever. Richard went through intense physical therapy sessions that felt pointless. The therapists moved his legs through exercises, stretching muscles that couldn't respond, working joints that Richard couldn't feel. It was exhausting and demoralizing. Some days Richard wanted to quit. He'd wake up thinking this whole thing was a massive mistake, that he'd let hope turn him into a fool. But Kenya never lost faith. Even when Richard snapped at her in frustration, even when he said cruel things about wasting his money on snake oil, she remained calm and consistent. Every morning and evening, she was there with the compound. Every day, she checked his neural responses, took detailed notes, adjusted the formula based on microscopic changes only she could see in the data. You know what's funny? Richard said one particularly bad day, around week 7. I've lost more hope doing this than I did just accepting I'd be paralyzed forever. At least then I wasn't disappointed every single morning when I woke up and still couldn't move my legs. Kenya didn't sugarcoat it. I know, and I'm sorry. I really believed we'd see results faster. She paused, looking at her charts. But something is happening on a cellular level. The electrical conductivity in your neural tissue is increasing. It's small, but it's there. Your body is responding. Just slower than I hoped. Or it's doing nothing, and you're seeing patterns in random noise because you want this to work as badly as I do. That's possible, too, Kenya admitted. But I don't think so. We just need to be patient. Week 8 brought a scare that almost ended everything. Richard developed a fever of 103 degrees. His personal doctor rushed to the facility, ready to call an ambulance and shut down the whole operation. Kenya was terrified that she'd caused an infection or triggered some toxic reaction, but tests showed it wasn't an infection. Richard's immune system was in overdrive, but not fighting bacteria or toxins. His body was responding to the neural regeneration, creating inflammation around the damaged tissue as new cells tried to grow. It was actually a good sign, though it felt terrible. Richard spent 3 days in bed, sweating through sheets, his whole body aching. Kenya barely left his side. Constantly monitoring his vitals, adjusting treatments, second-guessing every decision she'd made. If something happens to me, Richard said during one of his fever dreams, make sure my lawyers know this wasn't your fault. I chose this. I wanted this. Nothing's going to happen to you, Kenya said firmly, even though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The fever broke on the 4th day. Richard woke up weak and exhausted, but alive. And that's when everything changed. Week 12, day 3. A Tuesday that Kenya would remember for the rest of her life. Richard was on the therapy table, going through the same pointless exercises they'd done 100 times before. The physical therapist was moving his left leg, bending the knee when Richard suddenly gasped. Stop, he said urgently. What's wrong? The therapist froze. I felt something. Richard's eyes were wide. In my toe. My left toe. I felt you touching it. The room went completely silent. Kenya dropped the clipboard she was holding. The therapist looked at Richard like he'd grown a second head. Nobody moved for what felt like an eternity. Do it again, Richard whispered. Touch my toe again. The therapist gently pressed on Richard's left big toe. Richard's face transformed. There, right there. I can feel that. It's not much. It's like a faint tingling, but I can definitely feel it. Kenya rushed over with her testing equipment. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost couldn't hold the instruments properly. She ran every neural test she knew, reflex responses, sensitivity tests, electrical stimulation. The readings were undeniable. There was activity. Real measurable nerve activity in Richard's left leg. Oh my God, Kenya breathed. It's working. It's actually working. Richard started laughing, then crying, then laughing again. 2 years of nothing and now this, one toe. Such a small, insignificant thing that most people never think about. But to Richard, it was everything. It was proof that his body wasn't dead. It was evidence that the impossible might actually be possible. But Kenya's scientific mind kicked in immediately. Okay, we can't get ahead of ourselves. This is one toe. We need to document everything, adjust the treatment protocol, increase the therapy intensity. This is just the beginning. She was right. Over the next few days, the sensation spread. First just the toe, then the entire foot, then up to the ankle. It wasn't consistent. Some days Richard could feel everything clearly. Other days the sensation was faint or completely absent. It was frustrating and exhilarating at the same time. The real breakthrough came in week 14. Richard was doing his morning therapy when his left toe moved. Not a reflex. Not the therapist moving it. Richard thought about moving his toe and it moved. Just a tiny wiggle. Barely visible, but it was voluntary movement controlled by his own brain. The therapist actually screamed. Kenya started crying. Richard just stared at his toe like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Again, Kenya urged. Do it again, Richard concentrated. The toe wiggled. Then he tried the other toes. Nothing. Just the big toe on his left foot. But it was enough. It was more than enough. From that point on, progress came faster. Not easy, not simple, but steady. By week 16, Richard had regained some feeling in both feet. By week 18, he could wiggle 3 toes on his left foot and 2 on his right. The muscle control was weak, inconsistent, but it was there. The physical therapy became intense. Richard worked 8 hours a day, sometimes more. His muscles had atrophied significantly over 2 years of no use. Even as the nerves regenerated, his legs were weak and uncoordinated. Learning to move them again was like being a baby learning to walk, except harder because Richard's brain remembered how it was supposed to work and his body couldn't keep up. Kenya adjusted her compound formula constantly, analyzing every response, fine-tuning the concentration based on Richard's progress. She barely slept, surviving on coffee and the sheer excitement of watching her life's work actually succeed. But then the news leaked. Week 20, someone on the therapy staff talked. Maybe they told a friend who told a friend. Maybe they sold the story to a reporter. It didn't matter how it happened. What mattered was that suddenly, the entire world knew that billionaire Richard Chen was walking again after 2 years of paralysis. The media storm was instant and overwhelming. News vans camped outside the facility. Richard's phone exploded with calls from reporters, investors, former colleagues, people he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly very interested in his recovery. The medical community demanded to see research data. Pharmaceutical companies that had rejected Kenya's work suddenly wanted meetings. Richard's board found out, of course. Instead of being thrilled that their CEO was recovering, they were furious that he'd hidden this from them and conducted unauthorized medical experiments. Emergency meetings were called. Lawyers got involved. Some board members accused Richard of faking his paralysis in the first place, claiming the whole thing was an elaborate publicity stunt. The FDA launched an investigation. Kenya's compound hadn't been approved for human trials. She'd violated about a dozen regulations, even though Richard had consented to everything. There was talk of criminal charges, medical board hearings, lawsuits from people claiming they'd been denied access to a miracle cure. Kenya was terrified. "I'm so sorry," she told Richard. "I never meant to cause all this trouble. Maybe we should have gone through proper channels." "And waited 10 years while committees debated and pharmaceutical companies tried to patent your work?" Richard shook his head. He was standing now with the help of parallel bars, but standing nonetheless. "No, we did the right thing. Now we deal with the consequences." The attacks got personal. Some doctors claimed Kenya was a charlatan. Online trolls accused her of exploiting a desperate disabled man. A major pharmaceutical company released a statement questioning the legitimacy of Richard's recovery, suggesting that his paralysis might not have been as severe as reported. That's when Richard decided to fight back. He called a press conference. Against Kenya's advice, against his lawyer's strong recommendations, he decided to go public with everything. The conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, medical professionals, and curious onlookers. Richard wheeled himself to the podium, and for a moment, everyone expected him to speak from the chair. Instead, with Kenya standing nervously behind him, Richard gripped the edges of the podium and slowly, shakily, pulled himself to his feet. The room gasped. Cameras flashed like a lightning storm. Richard stood there, legs trembling with effort, sweat beading on his forehead, but standing completely on his own for the first time in 2 years. "My name is Richard Chen," he said, his voice steady despite his shaking legs. 2 years ago, I was told I'd never walk again. Every major medical institution, every specialist, every expert said my paralysis was permanent. They were wrong. He gestured to Kenya. This woman, Dr. Kenya Rodriguez, developed a treatment that everyone told her was impossible. 17 pharmaceutical companies rejected her research. She funded her work by taking 3 jobs and going into debt. And she succeeded where billion-dollar research institutions failed. Richard paused, holding on to the podium for support. Now people are trying to tear her down. They're questioning her credentials, her methods, her ethics. But here's what I know. I can stand here today because Kenya believed in the impossible, because she was willing to take a risk when everyone else played it safe. His legs were starting to give out. Kenya moved forward to help, but Richard waved her off. "I'm not completely healed. I still need intensive therapy. I can't run or jump or do most of what I used to do. But I can feel my legs. I can move them. I can stand. That's more than any traditional medicine gave me." Finally, Richard let Kenya help him back into the wheelchair. But the message was sent. The cameras had captured everything. By that evening, the video had millions of views. Public opinion began to shift. The press conference changed everything, but not in the way Richard and Kenya expected. Sure, public opinion shifted in their favor. Social media exploded with support. People shared the video of Richard standing, adding comments about hope and never giving up. Thousands of messages poured in from people with spinal injuries, begging for access to Kenya's treatment. Parents of paralyzed children sent heartbreaking emails. Veterans who'd been injured in combat reached out asking if this could help them, but the establishment didn't back down. If anything, they doubled their efforts to shut the whole thing down. The FDA issued a formal cease and desist order. Kenya was prohibited from administering her compound to anyone, including Richard. Medical licensing boards opened investigations. A congressional hearing was scheduled to discuss the dangers of unregulated medical experimentation. Richard's board used the controversy as ammunition. They argued that his judgment was compromised, that he'd put the company at legal risk by funding unauthorized medical research. The vote to remove him as CEO was moved up. They didn't even have the decency to wait until the scheduled date. Kenya sat in Richard's facility apartment the night after the board vote, watching him stare at the termination documents. After everything they'd been through, after all the progress he'd made, Richard had still lost his company. The empire he'd built from nothing now belonged to someone else. "I'm sorry," Kenya said quietly. "This is my fault. If I'd never approached you with this crazy idea, you'd still have your company." Richard looked up at her, and to her surprise, he was smiling. "Are you kidding? That company was killing me even before the accident. I spent 20 years building something that I thought mattered, and you know what? It doesn't, not really. We made phones and software. Useful stuff, sure, but nothing that actually changed lives in a meaningful way." He stood up from his chair, still shaky but stronger than he'd been even a week ago. "But this? What we're doing here? This actually matters. For the first time in my life, I'm part of something bigger than profit margins and stock prices." That's very philosophical for someone who just lost billions of dollars. I didn't lose billions. I still have billions, just not the company. Richard walked slowly to the window, his gait unsteady but deliberate. "And I'm going to use every penny of it to make sure your research reaches the people who need it." That's when they made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. Richard would use his personal fortune to establish a foundation dedicated to funding independent medical research. Not just Kenya's work, but any legitimate scientist whose ideas were too radical, too risky, or too unprofitable for traditional institutions to support. The Wellington Rodriguez Foundation launched 3 months later. Richard insisted Kenya's name come first, but she refused, so they compromised by putting both names in alphabetical order. The foundation's mission was simple but revolutionary. They would fund research that prioritized patient outcomes over profits, that took chances on unconventional approaches, that gave voices to scientists who'd been shut out of the traditional system. But they still had the FDA problem. Kenya's compound remained illegal for human use. Richard could continue his own treatment because he'd started before the cease and desist order, but they couldn't help anyone else. Watching desperate people beg for access to a treatment that might help them, while being legally prohibited from providing it, was torture for both of them. Kenya spent 6 months working with lawyers and medical ethicists to design a proper clinical trial, not the kind that took 15 years and cost hundreds of millions. A streamlined but rigorous trial that would prove safety and efficacy without unnecessary bureaucratic delays. Richard funded it completely, removing the profit motive that usually complicated medical research. The FDA pushed back initially, but public pressure was intense. Disability rights advocates organized protests. Patient groups filed petitions. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Kenya could proceed with a small-scale compassionate use trial under strict monitoring. 20 patients with spinal cord injuries would receive treatment while being carefully tracked for safety and effectiveness. The results were both encouraging and humbling. Kenya's compound didn't work for everyone. Spinal cord injuries were complex, and every case was different. Of the 20 patients, 6 showed significant improvement in nerve function. 4 showed minor improvements. 10 showed no response at all. It wasn't the miracle cure people hoped for, but it was real. measurable progress that gave hope where none had existed before. One of the success stories was a 19-year-old college student named David who'd been paralyzed in a diving accident. After 8 months of treatment, he regained enough function to walk with assistance. Not perfectly, not like before his injury, but enough to stand at his sister's wedding, enough to hug his mother without needing his wheelchair, enough to imagine a future that didn't look quite so limited. The failures were harder to accept. A 45-year-old construction worker showed no improvement after a full year of treatment. A military veteran actually experienced complications that required hospitalization. Kenya took every failure personally, staying up nights trying to understand why the treatment worked for some people, but not others. "You can't save everyone," Richard told her after a particularly difficult setback. He was walking now with just a cane, his recovery progressing steadily even 2 years after starting treatment. "But I should be able to help more people," Kenya insisted. "There's something I'm missing. Some variable I haven't identified that determines who responds to treatment. Then we keep researching. We keep trying. But Kenya, you need to understand something. Even if your treatment only helps 10% of spinal injury patients, that's still tens of thousands of lives changed. That's still a miracle." The foundation grew beyond just Kenya's research. They funded a team studying regenerative medicine for organ damage. They backed an oncologist whose unconventional cancer treatment approach had been rejected by traditional grants. They supported a neurologist researching new approaches to Alzheimer's that pharmaceutical companies considered too risky. Some of these projects failed. Research is like that, but some succeeded in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. The foundation became known as a place where brilliant but unconventional scientists could pursue ideas that traditional institutions wouldn't touch. Richard's life transformed in ways he never anticipated. He became an advocate for disability rights and medical research reform. He testified before Congress about the need to streamline FDA approval processes without compromising safety. He used his platform to push for better accessibility in technology and infrastructure. The billionaire who used to only care about quarterly earnings now spent his time fighting for people society often overlooked. His recovery continued, though it plateaued after about 3 years. He could walk unassisted for short distances. He could stand for extended periods. He could feel and move his legs, though not with the strength or coordination he'd had before the accident. He still used a wheelchair sometimes, especially for long distances or when he was tired. "Does it bother you?" Kenya asked him one day. "That you didn't get a complete recovery? That you're not exactly like you were before?" Richard thought about it. "Honestly, no. Because the person I was before the accident was kind of an asshole. I cared about money and status and beating competitors. I had surface-level relationships with people I kept at arm's length. I was successful but empty," he smiled. "The accident broke my body, but it also broke through all the walls I'd built. It made me human again. Or maybe human for the first time." 4 years after that first application of Kenya's compound, the FDA granted conditional approval for its use in spinal cord injury treatment. Not a blanket approval, but permission to use it in specific cases under medical supervision. It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was progress. Kenya finally achieved the recognition she deserved. She received the Lasker Award for medical research, often called the American Nobel. At 32 years old, she became one of the youngest recipients in the award's history. Standing on stage accepting the honor, she thought about her grandmother, who'd passed away the year before but lived long enough to see her granddaughter's research validated. "My grandmother used to tell me that the plants know secrets we've forgotten," Kenya said in her acceptance speech. "Modern medicine is incredible, but sometimes the answers we're looking for exist in the intersection between traditional knowledge and cutting-edge science. Between what we've always known and what we're just discovering." The Foundation's work continued to expand. They opened clinics in underserved communities where cutting-edge medical treatments were made available regardless of patients' ability to pay. They created scholarship programs for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue medical research. They funded studies that major pharmaceutical companies ignored because the patient populations were too small to be profitable. Richard and Kenya's partnership evolved beyond just professional collaboration. They became genuine friends, bonded by shared purpose and mutual respect. Kenya eventually left her role as Richard's caregiver, obviously, but stayed on as the Foundation's chief scientific officer. She built a world-class research team and continued refining her compound, finding ways to improve its effectiveness and understand why it worked for some patients but not others. They never pretended Kenya's treatment was a cure-all. The Foundation's literature was honest about success rates, about limitations, about the reality that spinal cord injury treatment remained incredibly complex. But they offered something powerful. They offered hope backed by legitimate science. They offered access to treatment for people who couldn't afford traditional medical care. They offered a model for how medical research could prioritize patients over profits. Richard often reflected on that rainy Tuesday night when the truck ran the red light. The accident that destroyed his old life had ultimately led him to his real purpose. He'd been successful before, wealthy and powerful, but he'd never been fulfilled. He'd never felt like what he was doing actually mattered in a deep, meaningful way. Now, sitting in Foundation meetings where they discussed which groundbreaking research to fund next, watching Kenya work with patients who reminded him of his own desperate situation 4 years ago, Richard understood something fundamental. The mysterious liquid hadn't just helped regenerate his damaged nerves. It had regenerated his sense of purpose, his connection to humanity, his understanding of what truly mattered in life. Kenya's compound was remarkable science. Yes, but the real miracle wasn't the chemistry or the nanotechnology. The real miracle was what happened when two people, both dismissed and underestimated by the establishment, decided to believe in the impossible and fight for it together. The real miracle was proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the most unexpected places, and that hope combined with brilliant science can actually change the world.